The pale glow of Faith Jensen's last candle flickered against the cabin walls, casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits. Outside, the Montana winter of 1876 howled with fury, battering the lonely homestead that had once been filled with hope. Now, it held only her desperate prayers and the dying embers of a fire too weak to ward off the bitter cold. Faith's trembling fingers clutched her mother's worn Bible as tears streaked down her hollow cheeks. 3 days without food, and the storm showing no signs of relenting. This would be her last night if help didn't come. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind's mournful wail. "I don't want to die alone out here." The candle's flame wavered dangerously, threatening to plunge her into darkness. Faith closed her eyes, summoning what little strength remained in her weakened body. 22 years old and already facing her end in this unforgiving wilderness, thousands of miles from the Boston home she'd left behind. The sudden pounding at the door nearly stopped her heart. Faith froze, clutching the Bible tighter. Bandits? Wolves somehow beating at her door? Her mind, addled by hunger and cold, conjured terrifying possibilities. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, followed by a deep voice that cut through the howling wind. "Hello? Anybody alive in there?" With trembling legs, Faith rose from her knees and approached the door, candle in hand. "Who's there?" she called, her voice cracking from disuse. "Mason Keller, madam. I saw your light through the storm. You need help." Faith hesitated, her hand on the crude wooden latch. In the 3 months since her father's death, she'd learned that the frontier held as many human predators as natural ones. But the cold certainty of death without aid made her decision. She opened the door. The wind nearly extinguished her candle as a mountain of a man filled the doorway, snow crusting his heavy sheepskin coat and wide-brimmed hat. His face, partially hidden behind a frost-covered beard, revealed kind eyes that widened at the sight of her. "Good Lord, miss," he said, quickly stepping inside and closing the door against the howling storm. "You're half frozen." Faith swayed on her feet, the room suddenly spinning around her. I was praying for help," she whispered, her vision tunneling. "Are you real?" The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the stranger lunging forward, his strong arms catching her before she hit the floor. "Your answer's here," came his distant voice as consciousness slipped away. Faith awoke to unfamiliar sensations: warmth, the aroma of cooking food, and the steady crackle of a roaring fire. For a moment, she wondered if she had died, and this was heaven's welcome. Then the pain in her empty stomach reminded her she was very much alive. She blinked open her eyes to find herself wrapped in every blanket the cabin possessed, lying on her small cot near a fireplace that now blazed with life. The stranger Mason was hunched by the stove, his broad back to her as he stirred something in her mother's old pot. "You're awake," he said without turning, as if he could sense her consciousness returning. "Good. You had me worried." Faith tried to sit up, but her weakness made it difficult. "How long was I?" "About 2 hours." Mason turned then, and in the firelight, she could properly see him for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the open sky. His beard was trimmed shorter than most frontier men, revealing a strong jaw and the hint of a scar along his left cheek. But it was his eyes that held her deep blue and steady as still water. "I've made some stew," he said, gesturing toward the pot. "Nothing fancy, just some dried beef and a few potatoes I had in my saddlebag. But it'll put strength back in you." As if on cue, her stomach growled loudly, causing a blush to heat her cheeks. Mason's mouth quirked in the shadow of a smile as he ladled stew into a bowl and brought it to her. "Eat slow," he cautioned, helping her sit up. "Your stomach won't be used to food after going empty so long." Faith wanted to devour the simple meal in one desperate gulp, but she heeded his advice, taking small, careful spoonfuls. Each bite seemed to restore a piece of her fading soul. "Thank you," she said between mouthfuls. I don't know how to repay you." Mason shook his head, moving back to stoke the fire. "No need for that talk. No decent man leaves another soul to die in a storm." He glanced around the Spartan cabin. "You out here alone?" Faith nodded, the simple movement requiring more energy than it should. "My father and I came west last spring. He passed in October. Fever took him. And you stayed on? Had nowhere else to go, she replied simply. Everything we had went into this homestead. Father said we'd make it. She looked down at the half-empty bowl. I thought I could manage until spring. Mason's expression darkened. No one should winter alone out here, especially not, he caught himself. Especially not a woman? Faith finished, a spark of her old spirit flaring despite her weakness. His weathered face broke into an unexpected smile. I was going to say especially not someone from back east, but I reckon both fit. He nodded toward her hands. Those aren't the hands of someone born to frontier life. Faith glanced down at her fingers, once soft and suited for pianos and needlework, now calloused but still unmistakably those of someone who hadn't spent a lifetime in hard labor. Boston, she admitted. Father was a clerk at a shipping company. After Mother died, he couldn't bear the city anymore. Said we'd find a new beginning out west. Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. The West has a way of calling to those looking to outrun their grief. He stood and moved to the window, pushing back the rough burlap curtain to peer into the storm. This blizzard isn't letting up anytime soon. If you don't mind, I'll bunk by the fire. My horse is in your lean-to. Hope that's acceptable. Faith suddenly realized the impropriety of their situation, an unmarried woman alone with a strange man in a remote cabin. Back in Boston, such a scenario would have meant irrevocable ruin. But Boston's rules seemed laughably insignificant against the Montana winter's deadly grip. Of course, she said. I'd be dead if not for you. Mason nodded, seeming to read her thoughts. Don't worry, Miss Jensen. Your reputation's safe with me. I was raised better than that. Something about his straightforward decency loosened the knot of tension in Faith's chest. She finished her stew in silence, watching as he efficiently moved around her small cabin, adding wood to the fire, checking the windows against the wind, moving with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to surviving. How did you find me? She asked finally. This homestead is miles from anywhere. Mason settled on the floor near the fire, his back against the wall. I was heading to Helena when the storm hit. Spotted your candle light through a break in the trees. Figured anyone foolish enough to be out here alone might need checking on. He gave her a pointed look. I was right. Faith couldn't argue with that assessment. Well, Mr. Keller, it seems God answered my prayers through you. Something flickered across his face, discomfort, perhaps. Just Mason, please. And I'm no answer to prayers, madam. Just a cowboy with good timing. Faith settled back against her pillow, feeling the warm stew and the fire's heat working their restorative magic. Then I thank you for your good timing, Mason. Her eyelids grew heavy, the weeks of fear and hunger catching up now that safety had arrived. And it's Faith. Just Faith. As sleep reclaimed her, she thought she heard him murmur, Rest easy, Faith. You're not alone anymore. The blizzard raged for 3 more days, trapping them together in the tiny cabin. In another life, another world, such forced proximity would have been scandalous. In the reality of the frontier winter, it was salvation. Mason proved himself not just a rescuer, but a provider. Each morning, Faith woke to find him already moving about the cabin, fire stoked high, coffee brewing from his own precious supplies. He ventured out into the blinding snow to check his horse and bring in more firewood, returning with his coat crusted white and his beard sparkling with ice crystals that melted in the cabin's growing warmth. By the second day, Faith had regained enough strength to insist on contributing. Despite Mason's protests, she took over the cooking, transforming his simple provisions into meals that made him raise his eyebrows in appreciation. Where'd a Boston girl learn to make biscuits like these? He asked, savoring one with the last of his coffee. Faith smiled, the expression feeling foreign after weeks of solitude and fear. My mother believed every woman should know how to cook, even if she expected to have servants her whole life. She needed the last of the flour for tomorrow's bread. Said it was the only way to properly manage a household. Mason watched her hands work the dough. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Faith felt the familiar pang of loss, though somehow less sharp than before. She would have hated this cabin, though. Too small, too crude. But she would have made it beautiful somehow. She looked around at the rough-hewn walls. I've tried, but you've done well, Mason said, his voice gentle. Most first-year homesteaders barely survive, let alone make a home. On the 3rd morning, As they sat sharing breakfast, Faith finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been growing in her mind. What will happen when the storm passes? Mason looked up from his plate, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. That depends. On what? On what you want to happen. He set down his fork. The truth is, Faith, you can't stay here alone. Not through the rest of winter. The words stung, though she knew they were true. I have nowhere else to go. You have options, Mason said carefully. There's a settlement about 20 miles east. Good people. They'd take you in until spring. Faith stared into her coffee cup. And then what? Be someone's burden? Their charity case? Or, Mason continued, as if he hadn't heard her. You could come with me to Helena. It's a growing town. Work for young women who can read and write, which I'm guessing you can. I can, she confirmed. But Helena is what, 100 miles from here? Thereabouts. Faith stood and moved to the small window, pushing aside the curtain. The storm had lessened overnight, the swirling snow now falling in lazy drifts rather than violent sheets. Leaving meant abandoning her father's dream, admitting defeat against the wilderness he believed would give them a new beginning. This land, she said softly. It's all I have left of him, of his hopes. Mason came to stand beside her, keeping a respectful distance. Land will wait. It's been here long before any of us. Will be here long after. But you, Faith, you need to survive to come back to it. She turned to look up at him, struck by the sincerity in his weathered face. In just 3 days, this stranger had become a fixed point in her world, as essential as the fire he kept burning. And if I wanted to return? In the spring? Something warmed in his gaze. Then I'd make sure you got back here. The simple promise settled over her like a blanket. Why would you do that for me? You don't even know me. Mason looked away, back out to the endless white landscape. Maybe I recognize something in you. Something worth preserving. He cleared his throat. Besides, a man gets tired of his own company after a while. Having someone to help through a hard time. It's no burden. That evening, as the storm finally began to break, Faith made her decision. She would go to Helena, find work, and return in the spring with proper supplies and knowledge to make the homestead thrive. It wasn't abandonment, she told herself. It was strategic retreat. As she packed her meager belongings, her mother's Bible, the few clothes worth taking, the cameo locket with her parents' portraits, Faith felt a strange mixture of grief and hope. The cabin had never truly been home, but it represented everything her father had sacrificed for. We'll leave at first light, Mason said, checking his rifle before setting it by the door. Should take us 4 days if the weather holds, longer if it doesn't. Faith nodded, folding her mother's quilt with careful hands. I've never ridden that far before. Mason's expression softened. We'll take it slow, and you'll ride Briar. She's steady as they come. And you? I've spent more hours walking than riding. Won't be the first time I've led a horse with a rider. That night, their last in the cabin, a strange melancholy settled over Faith. She sat before the fire, staring into the flames as Mason cleaned his revolver at the table. Tell me about yourself, she said suddenly. You know my story, but I know almost nothing about you. Mason's hand stilled on his weapon. For a moment, she thought he might deflect the question. Then he set the gun down and turned to face her. Not much to tell that's worth hearing, he said, but continued anyway. Born in Missouri. Father was a farrier. Taught me his trade, but I wasn't one for staying put. Headed west at 17, worked cattle drives, broke horses, did some scouting for the army. He shrugged. Seen most of the territory between here and California. And family. A shadow crossed his face. Lost my parents to cholera when I was 19. No siblings. I'm sorry, Faith said softly. Long time ago now. No wife? Children? The question felt bold, improper even, but the usual social constraints seemed distant in this isolated cabin. Mason shook his head. Never found the right situation for settling down. Cowboy's life doesn't lend itself to permanence. Yet something in his tone made Faith wonder if there was more to that story. She didn't press, sensing the boundaries of his openness. What about Helena? She asked instead. Have you been there before? His expression lightened. Several times. It's growing fast since the gold strikes, but it's not like some of the wilder mining towns. Got a proper church, school, even a theater. You'll find decent people there. Faith tried to imagine its streets, buildings, people. After months of isolation, The thought was both thrilling and intimidating. "And you?" she asked. "What takes you there now?" Mason hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded letter. "Got this 2 months back. Job offer from an old friend who runs a livery stable there. Says Helena's growing so fast he can't keep up with the demand for good horses." He tucked the letter away. Thought it might be time to try putting down some roots. Faith smiled, warmed by this glimpse into his future plans. "So you're not just a wandering cowboy after all." Something like embarrassment crossed his face. "Reckon even a saddle tramp gets tired eventually." The fire popped loudly, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind had finally died down, leaving an unnatural silence that emphasized how alone they were in the vast wilderness. "Thank you," Faith said suddenly, the words bursting from her heart. "Not just for saving my life, but for being kind about it. For not making me feel foolish for trying to survive out here." Mason's gaze met hers across the small room, and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection forged in the crucible of shared isolation. "You're not foolish, Faith." "Stubborn, maybe," he said with the hint of a smile. "But not foolish. What you tried to do took courage." She looked away, uncomfortable with the admiration in his eyes. "Failed courage isn't worth much." "Disagree," he said firmly. "Trying and failing still puts you ahead of most who never try at all." He stood and moved toward his bedroll by the fire. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's a long day." As Faith lay in her cot that night, listening to Mason's steady breathing across the room, she realized how quickly she'd grown accustomed to his presence. The thought of traveling with him, of placing her future in his hands, should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the first right decision she'd made since her father's death. With that comforting thought, she drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd had in months, her prayers now ones of gratitude rather than desperate pleas. Dawn broke clear and cold, the sun transforming the snow-covered landscape into a blinding sea of white. Faith stood on the cabin's small porch, breathing in the crisp air as Mason readied the horses. He'd brought two his own sturdy gelding and a gentle mare he called Briar. Faith watched as he efficiently packed their meager supplies, his movements practiced and economical. "Once more," he said, turning to her with unexpected solemnity. "Are you certain about this? Once we're a day out, turning back gets complicated." Faith took a last look at the cabin. In the morning light, its flaws were stark: the sagging roof, the gaps in the chinking that let in the brutal wind, the smallness of it against the vast Montana wilderness. Her father had died believing this place would be their salvation. She had nearly followed him to the grave, trying to honor that belief. "I'm certain," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "This place will still be here in spring." Mason nodded, something like approval warming his gaze. He helped her mount Briar, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The casual touch sent an unexpected warmth through her body despite the biting cold. "Keep your feet in the stirrups and let Briar do the work," he instructed, adjusting the stirrup length. "She knows what she's doing even if you don't." Faith gathered the reins as he'd shown her, feeling both terrified and exhilarated. "I've only ridden in a city park with a leading rein." Mason's mouth quirked. "Bit different out here, but you'll learn fast." He mounted his own horse with fluid grace. "Ready?" With one last glance at the cabin, Faith nodded. "Ready." The first day's journey passed in relative silence. Mason led them through the snow-laden forest with confident ease, occasionally pointing out landmarks or offering quiet advice about riding. Faith, sore and unaccustomed to hours in the saddle, focused on following his instructions and remaining upright. By midday, they had covered perhaps 10 miles. Mason called a halt beside a small frozen stream, helping Faith dismount on legs that felt like jelly. "You're doing well," he said, his breath clouding in the cold air. Most greenhorns would be complaining by now. Faith attempted to straighten her back, wincing at the unfamiliar ache. "Who says I'm not complaining in my mind?" That earned her a chuckle as he rummaged through his saddlebag for jerky and hardtack. They ate their simple meal sitting on a fallen log that Mason cleared of snow, the horses grazing nearby on what little winter forage they could find. "We'll make another 10 miles before nightfall," Mason said, studying the sky. "There's an old trapper's cabin I know of. Not much, but better than sleeping under the stars in this cold." Faith nodded, trying not to think about how her body would feel after another 10 miles. How do you know this country so well? Worked as a scout for a cattle drive through here 3 years back, he replied. Had to find routes with water and grazing. Makes you pay attention. As they continued their journey that afternoon, Faith began to see the landscape through new eyes. What had once seemed a monotonous expanse of threatening wilderness now revealed subtle variations, the different textures of bare trees against the sky, the way certain slopes caught the sun while others remained in perpetual shadow, the tracks of animals telling stories of life, continuing despite the harsh conditions. Mason rode mostly ahead, but occasionally dropped back to ride alongside her, pointing out things she might have missed: an eagle's nest high in a dead pine, the distinctive tracks of a mountain lion, a distant herd of elk moving like shadows through a far valley. By the time they reached the trapper's cabin, darkness was falling fast. The cabin was little more than a crude shelter, smaller even than the homestead Faith had left behind, but Mason soon had a fire going in its small stone fireplace. "It's not much," he apologized, watching as Faith huddled near the flames, "but it'll keep us from freezing." "It's perfect," she assured him, meaning it. After hours in the saddle, any shelter seemed luxurious. As they shared another simple meal, Faith found herself studying Mason's profile in the firelight. The planes of his face, the way the flames highlighted the auburn tones in his brown beard, the careful strength in his hands as he whittled a piece of kindling into intricate shapes, all of it fascinated her in ways she hadn't expected. "What will you do in Helena?" she asked, breaking their comfortable silence. "Besides work at the livery?" Mason seemed surprised by the question. "Hadn't thought much beyond that," he admitted. "Find lodgings. Learn the town. See if it feels right. And if it doesn't," he shrugged, "move on, I suppose. That's been my pattern. Doesn't that get lonely?" The question slipped out before Faith could consider its propriety. Mason was quiet for so long that she feared she'd offended him. Finally, he set down his whittling and looked directly at her. "Yes," he said simply, "it does. But loneliness is familiar territory for me. I know its boundaries." Something in his tone made Faith's heart ache. "I understand that. After Mother died, Father and I lived in the same house, but we were both alone with our grief. Sometimes that's the loneliest kind of solitude, being near someone, but separated all the same." Mason nodded slowly. "You have a way of seeing true, Faith Jensen." The compliment warmed her more than the fire. "Not always. If I did, I might have convinced Father that two people with no farming experience shouldn't try to homestead in Montana." "Maybe," Mason conceded. "Or maybe you gave him the one thing he needed most in his grief, someone who believed in his dream, even knowing its flaws." Faith had never considered it that way. The thought that her support, rather than her practical objections, might have been what her father truly needed brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Mason noticed and respectfully looked away, giving her a moment to compose herself. He returned to his whittling, and soon the only sounds were the crackling fire and the soft scrape of his knife against wood. Later, as they prepared for sleep, Mason insisting she take the cabin's narrow cot, while he made do with his bedroll on the floor, Faith found herself reluctant for the day to end. "Mason," she said quietly as he banked the fire for the night. I'm glad it was you who saw my candle." In the dimming light, she caught the flash of his smile. "So am I, Faith. So am I." The next 3 days fell into a rhythm, riding from dawn until dusk, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat hasty meals. Faith's body protested at first and used to hours in the saddle, but gradually she adapted, finding a harmony with Briar's steady gait. Mason proved to be not just a skilled guide, but a patient teacher. He showed Faith how to read the weather from cloud patterns, how to spot game trails that offered easier passage through difficult terrain, how to listen to the forest's subtle language of creaks and calls. Their third night on the trail, they were forced to make camp in the open, no cabin or shelter within reach before nightfall. Mason worked efficiently, clearing snow from beneath a stand of pines and building a fire that sent sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. Faith watched, huddled in her coat, as he constructed a simple lean-to of pine boughs. "It's not much," he said, echoing his words from the trapper's cabin, "but it'll block the wind and reflect the fire's heat." Indeed, once the makeshift shelter was complete and their bedrolls arranged inside, Faith found it surprisingly cozy. They sat side by side beneath the boughs, sharing coffee from Mason's dented tin pot and the last of the biscuits Faith had baked before leaving the homestead. "Tomorrow we should reach the main trail to Helena," Mason said, gazing into the fire. "It'll be easier going from there. Maybe another day and a half if the weather holds." Faith felt a strange pang at his words. Their journey, difficult as it was, had created a private world between them, a bubble of shared experience outside ordinary life. In Helena, with its streets and buildings and people, everything would change. "Will you stay?" she asked suddenly. "In Helena, I mean. Give it a real chance." Mason glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Planning to, unless I find reason not to." "Good." Faith stared into her coffee cup. "It would be nice to know there's at least one familiar face in town." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the pop and hiss of the fire. Above, the stars blazed with cold brilliance in a way Faith had never seen in Boston's smoky skies. "They're beautiful," she murmured, tipping her head back to take in the vast celestial panorama. Mason followed her gaze upward. "One thing I've always loved about the open country, you can see all the way to forever at night." "Do you know the constellations?" Faith asked. He nodded. "Some. Enough to navigate by." He pointed upward. "There's the North Star, of course. And see those 3 bright stars in a row. That's Orion's belt." Faith leaned closer, following the line of his arm. "I see it. And there," he continued, shifting slightly, his shoulder now touching hers. "That bright one is Sirius, the dog star. Brightest in the sky." Faith was acutely aware of his proximity, of the solid warmth of him beside her in the cold night. "My father tried to teach me the stars when I was young," she said softly. "But Boston's lights and buildings hid too many of them." "Out here, nothing's hidden," Mason replied, his voice equally quiet. "Everything's laid bare under that sky. Makes a man reckon honestly with himself." Faith turned to look at him, struck by the philosophical turn of his words. His face was half in shadow, half illuminated by the fire's glow, his eyes reflecting pinpoints of starlight. "And what have you reckoned with, Mason Keller?" He met her gaze, and for a breathtaking moment, Faith thought he might lean closer still. Then he straightened, putting a careful few inches between them. "Enough to know my limits," he said, the words carrying a weight she couldn't fully decipher. "We should get some rest. Dawn comes early." That night, lying in her bedroll with the fire's dying embers painting the lean-to's roof with shifting shadows, Faith found sleep elusive. Just beyond the shelter, she could hear Mason's steady breathing, could sense his protective presence even in the darkness. She had known him less than a week, yet he had become essential to her world in a way that defied rational explanation. Was it merely gratitude for her rescue? Or something deeper, something growing in the fertile soil of shared days and campfire conversations? Faith closed her eyes, pushing the questions away. Helena waited, and with it, decisions that couldn't be made under this vast, star-filled sky. Morning brought low, threatening clouds and a sharp drop in temperature. Mason studied the sky with concern as they broke camp. "Storm coming," he said grimly. "We need to make the main trail by midday." They rode harder than previous days, Mason setting a pace that had Faith clinging to her saddle horn as Briar navigated increasingly difficult terrain. By late morning, snow began to fall at first in lazy, scattered flakes, then in thickening sheets that reduced visibility to a few yards. "There," Mason called back to her, pointing ahead to what appeared to be a cut through the hills. "That's the Helena Road." Faith squinted through the swirling snow, relief flooding her as she made out the wider, more established trail. They had been traveling cross-country, following game trails and old Indian paths that only Mason could discern. The prospect of a proper road, even one covered in fresh snow, seemed luxurious. As they emerged onto the trail, Mason reined in his horse, waiting for Faith to draw alongside. Snow clung to his hat and shoulders, and his beard was frosted white. "We need shelter," he shouted over the rising wind. "There's a way station about 5 miles ahead. We can wait out the worst of it there." Faith nodded, too cold for words. Her fingers, despite the woolen gloves Mason had insisted she wear, felt numb and clumsy on the reins. The excitement of their approaching destination had been replaced by the more immediate concern of survival. The 5 miles to the way station stretched endlessly. The snow fell heavier, the wind driving it horizontally into their faces. Faith kept her head down, trusting Briar to follow Mason's mount. Occasionally, his voice would drift back to her words of encouragement, assurances that they were almost there, but mostly there was only the howl of the storm and the labored breathing of the horses. When the way station finally appeared through the white curtain of snow, Faith could have wept with relief. It was a substantial log structure, clearly built to withstand Montana's fierce winters, with smoke rising from a stone chimney. Mason helped her dismount, her legs so stiff and cold she nearly collapsed against him. "Almost there," he murmured, supporting her with a strong arm around her waist as they staggered toward the building. The door swung open before they reached it, revealing a burly man with a thick mustache and suspicious eyes. "Station's closed for regular traffic," he called out. "Storm's too bad." "We're not regular traffic," Mason replied, his voice firm despite his obvious exhaustion. "We've got a woman half frozen here. Need shelter until this passes." The man hesitated, then stepped back. "Come in then. But the horses go in the stable round back." "She goes in first," Mason insisted. "I'll see to the horses." Before Faith could protest, the station keeper had ushered her inside, and Mason had disappeared back into the swirling white with both sets of reins in his hand. The interior of the way station was blessedly warm, heated by a massive stone fireplace at one end of the main room. A long table with benches occupied the center, while rough bunks lined the walls. 2 other travelers, a grizzled older man and a younger fellow with a clerk's pale complexion, looked up from their card game as Faith entered. "Get yourself by the fire, miss," the station keeper said gruffly, but not unkindly. "Your man'll see to the horses." Faith was too cold to correct his assumption about Mason. She moved gratefully toward the fire, extending her numb hands toward its welcome heat. Behind her, she heard the door open again, bringing a swirl of snow and cold air as Mason returned. "Storm's getting worse," he announced, stamping snow from his boots. "Horses are settled. Don't think we'll be moving on until tomorrow at earliest." He crossed to Faith, his concerned gaze assessing her condition. "How are you faring?" "Better now," she assured him, though her body still trembled with cold. "This fire is heaven." Mason nodded, satisfied, and turned to the station keeper. "Got space for 2 more overnight?" "We can pay." The man shrugged. "Bunks are open. $5 each, includes supper and breakfast." Faith gasped at the exorbitant price, but Mason merely nodded, reaching into his coat to extract the money. Fair enough in this weather. As the evening progressed, the way station revealed itself as a microcosm of frontier society. The station keeper, who introduced himself as Harlan, served a hearty stew and cornbread to his stranded guests. The older traveler, Ferguson, was a fur trapper heading to Helena to sell his winter catch. The younger man, Peters, was a mining company clerk returning from an assignment at a remote silver claim. Faith, the only woman present, initially felt self-conscious, but the men's behavior remained respectful, if curious. It was clear they wondered what her relationship was with Mason, but frontier etiquette prevented direct questioning. After the meal, Ferguson produced a battered harmonica and began playing folk tunes that reminded Faith of her childhood. Peters revealed a passable singing voice, and even Harlan joined in on the choruses of the more popular songs. Mason sat beside Faith on the bench, close enough that she could feel the solid warmth of him, but maintaining a careful propriety that both frustrated and touched her. "Mr. Ferguson called during a break in the music, nodding toward Mason. "You look like a man who might know the Colorado Trail." Mason shook his head. "I know it, but I don't sing." "Everyone sings," Ferguson insisted. "Especially cowboys." "Not this one," Mason replied firmly, though his tone remained good-natured. Faith found herself studying his profile, wondering about the stories he hadn't told her, the experiences that had shaped this quiet, capable man who had appeared at her door like an answer to prayer. Later, as the others began settling into their bunks for the night, Mason pulled Faith aside, speaking in low tones. "The women's sleeping area is through that door," he said, nodding toward a smaller adjoining room. "It'll be basic, but private." Faith nodded, suddenly reluctant to be separated from him after days of such close proximity. "And you'll be out here with the others." His expression softened at whatever he saw in her face. "I'll be right outside your door. Nothing to fear." "I'm not afraid," she said truthfully. "Not anymore. Not with you near." Something flashed in his eyes, a hunger quickly banked, a longing controlled. "Faith," he began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "We'll reach Helena tomorrow if the storm breaks. You'll need to think about what comes next." "What comes next for us, you mean?" She hadn't intended to be so bold, but the words emerged of their own accord. Mason's gaze held her steadily. "I mean for you. Helena will offer opportunities, choices. Don't let gratitude to a passing cowboy limit those choices." "Is that what you think this is?" Faith asked, stung by his characterization. "Gratitude? I think," he said carefully, "that when a person has been drowning and someone throws them a rope, it's natural to feel a powerful connection to that rescuer. But such feelings need testing in calmer waters." Before Faith could respond to this frustratingly reasonable assessment, Ferguson struck up another tune on his harmonica, and the moment between them shattered. "Get some rest," Mason said, stepping back. "Tomorrow will be another long day." In the small women's dormitory, Faith lay awake long into the night, Mason's words turning in her mind. Was he right? Was what she felt merely the desperate gratitude of a rescued soul? Or was it something truer, something that would survive their arrival in Helena? She had no answers, only the certainty that Mason Keller had become far more to her than a passing cowboy with good timing. The storm broke during the night, and dawn revealed a transformed landscape, pristine white as far as the eye could see, with the sun creating diamond sparkles across the untouched snow. Faith emerged from the women's dormitory to find Mason already awake, sharing coffee with Ferguson by the fire. "Good morning," she said, conscious of her rumpled appearance after days on the trail. Mason looked up, his expression warming. "Morning. Harlan's fixing breakfast. Should be on the trail within the hour." "How far to Helena?" she asked, accepting the cup of coffee he poured for her. 20 miles or so. Easy day's ride now that we're on the main road." 20 miles. By nightfall, they would reach Helena, and this interlude, this strange, intense time out of time would end. The thought left Faith feeling hollow despite the hot coffee warming her hands. Breakfast was a hasty affair of flapjacks and salt pork. As they prepared to depart, Faith found herself dawdling, checking and rechecking her few belongings while Mason settled their bill with Harlan. Ferguson and Peters had already departed, eager to reach Helena before another storm could develop. Soon, only Faith and Mason remained, standing in the way station's yard beside their horses. "Ready?" Mason asked, his hand steady on Briar's bridle as he helped Faith mount. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Something had shifted between them since their conversation the previous night, a careful distance introduced where before there had been growing closeness. The ride to Helena passed largely in silence. The main road, while snow-covered, was well-marked and easy to follow, requiring none of the intense concentration their cross-country journey had demanded. Without the constant need for instruction or warning, Mason rode slightly ahead, his broad back a familiar sight that Faith found herself memorizing, uncertain how many more times she would see it. By mid-afternoon, the landscape began to change. Isolated cabins appeared with increasing frequency. Twice they passed wagons heading the opposite direction, their drivers nodding in greeting. And then, as they crested a final rise, Helena spread below them, a substantial town nestled in a valley, smoke rising from countless chimneys, the spire of a church catching the late afternoon sun. Faith reined in beside Mason, both of them gazing down at their destination. "It's larger than I expected," she said, taking in the grid of streets, the substantial buildings interspersed with more modest structures. Mason nodded. "Grows every year. Gold brought people, but it's becoming more than just a mining town now." They descended into the valley, the sounds of civilization growing louder as they approached, hammering from a construction site, the distant whistle of a steam engine, the murmur of human voices after days of only wind and animal calls. As they entered the town proper, Faith felt overwhelmingly conspicuous. Her clothing, practical for the trail but decidedly unfashionable, drew curious glances from the women they passed. The men's gazes, however, seemed to register only that she rode beside Mason Keller, and whatever they saw in his expression discouraged further interest. "We'll find you lodging first," Mason said as they turned onto what appeared to be the main street. "There's a respectable boarding house for women near the church. The widow who runs it is strict but fair." Faith nodded, suddenly terrified at the prospect of being alone in this unfamiliar place. "And you? Where will you stay?" "There's rooms above the livery where I'll be working," he replied. "Nothing fancy, but it'll serve." They reached the boarding house, a well-maintained two-story structure with lace curtains visible in the windows. Mason helped Faith dismount, her body stiff after the long day's ride. "Wait here," he said. "I'll speak to Mrs. Holloway." Faith stood beside the horses, acutely aware of passers-by studying her with undisguised curiosity. A young woman arriving in town with only a cowboy as escort was clearly an object of speculation. Mason returned a few minutes later, his expression relieved. "She has a room available. I've paid for 2 weeks. That should give you time to find your feet, maybe secure employment." "Mason, I can't accept," he cut off her protest with a raised hand. "Consider it in advance. You can repay me when you're settled." Before she could argue further, the boarding house door opened to reveal a formidable-looking woman in her 50s, dressed in somber black relieved only by a white lace collar. "Miss Jensen," she called. "I'm Mrs. Holloway. Your room is prepared." Faith looked helplessly at Mason. Everything was moving too quickly, the familiar rhythm of their journey together suddenly shattered by civilization's expectations and proprieties. "Go on," he said gently. "Get settled. I need to report to the livery and see about the horses." Seeing her hesitation, he added, "I'll call on you tomorrow. We can talk about next steps then." Recognizing the logic of his plan despite her emotional resistance, Faith nodded. "Tomorrow, then." Mrs. Holloway stepped forward, taking charge of the situation with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Keller has explained your circumstances, Miss Jensen. Most unfortunate about your father. But you'll find Helena a welcoming community for those willing to work hard." She gestured toward the house. "Now come along. A hot bath and proper meal will set you right after such a journey." Faith allowed herself to be guided toward the boarding house, looking back only once to see Mason already mounting his horse, his expression unreadable at this distance. And just like that, their wilderness idyll ended, replaced by the complex social fabric of a frontier town. The boarding house proved comfortable if Spartan, and Mrs. Holloway, despite her formidable exterior, showed unexpected kindness. The promised bath was heavenly after days on the trail, and the meal that followed, roast chicken, fresh bread, vegetables preserved from last summer's garden, seemed like a feast. The other boarders, all women of various ages, greeted Faith with friendly curiosity. There was Miss Abernathy, a spinster schoolteacher, the Wilson sisters, who ran a millinery shop, and young Margaret Dawson, who worked as a clerk at the town's largest dry goods store. "There's good opportunity in Helena for educated women," Miss Abernathy informed Faith over dinner. "The town's growing so rapidly that skills like reading, writing, and ciphering are in high demand. The mercantile is always looking for help," Margaret added. "Mr. Donovan, the owner, mentioned just yesterday he needs someone who can manage correspondence and keep proper books." Faith listened gratefully to their suggestions. The overwhelming prospect of starting anew in this strange place made less daunting by their matter-of-fact assistance. But as she lay in her narrow bed that night, in a room that, while clean and warm, felt sterile after the intimate confines of camp and cabin, Faith found herself missing Mason with an intensity that surprised her. Had it really been only a week since he knocked on her cabin door? How had he become so essential to her sense of security, of possibility? Mrs. Holloway's strict rules included no male visitors beyond the formal parlor, and then only during designated hours. Faith would have to wait until the following afternoon to see Mason again, the longest they had been separated since her rescue. The next day dawned clear and cold. Faith rose early, dressed in her best remaining dress, a simple blue wool that had survived the journey relatively unscathed, and ventured downstairs to breakfast. "I'd like to explore the town today," she announced to Mrs. Holloway. "Perhaps inquire about employment opportunities." The older woman nodded approvingly. "A sensible approach. Helena rewards initiative." She hesitated, then added with careful neutrality. Mr. Keller indicated he would call at 2 o'clock. I've approved his visit to the parlor. Faith tried to keep her expression composed despite the leap of her heart. Thank you. I appreciate your flexibility. Mr. Keller is known to me by reputation, Mrs. Holloway replied. His former employer, Colonel Randall, spoke highly of his character. That, combined with the unusual circumstances of your arrival, warrants some accommodation of the usual rules. This revelation that Mason's reputation preceded him, that it was apparently positive enough to impress the formidable Mrs. Holloway, filled Faith with a warm glow of pride that surprised her with its intensity. The morning passed in a whirlwind of new experiences. Faith walked Helena's bustling streets, marveling at the contrast between the town's frontier rawness and its aspirations to civilization. Alongside rough saloons and hastily constructed miners' lodgings stood substantial brick buildings housing banks, a courthouse, and various businesses with plate glass windows and painted signs. Following Margaret's suggestion, Faith visited Donovan's Mercantile, a large establishment on the main street. Mr. Donovan, a jovial Irishman with shrewd eyes, interviewed her on the spot, clearly impressed by her Boston education and refined manners. We've grown beyond my ability to manage the accounts properly, he admitted. I need someone with a head for figures and a legible hand. The position pays $15 weekly, with Sundays free. It was a generous offer, more than Faith had dared hope for. With such wages, she could save toward returning to the homestead in spring, properly equipped this time. I would be delighted to accept, she told him. When would you like me to begin? Monday next, he replied, if that suits. Give you time to settle in. With her immediate future secured, Faith walked back to the boarding house with a lighter heart. The prospect of independence, of making her own way without being a burden, filled her with cautious optimism. As 2 o'clock approached, however, all thoughts of employment faded beneath a growing anticipation. Faith found herself changing her dress, pinning and repinning her hair, behaviors she would have dismissed as frivolous just weeks before. Mrs. Holloway's grandfather clock was striking 2 when the door knocker sounded. Faith forced herself to remain seated in the parlor, listening as the landlady's measured footsteps crossed to the entrance. Mason's deep voice carried from the hallway, followed by Mrs. Holloway's more muted tones. Then the parlor door opened, and he was there. Faith's first thought was how different he looked, not in his trail clothes, but in clean denims and a pressed shirt, his beard trimmed neatly, his hair still damp from washing. But his eyes were the same, steady and warm as they met hers. Miss Jensen, he said formally, conscious of Mrs. Holloway hovering nearby. Mr. Keller, she replied, rising. How good of you to call. I'll bring tea, Mrs. Holloway announced. You may have 30 minutes, as per house rules. Once she had departed, Mason relaxed slightly, moving further into the room. You look well, he said. The comforts of civilization seem to agree with you. It feels strange, Faith admitted. After everything. To be somewhere so normal. He nodded, understanding. I visited your horses this morning. They're settled at the livery. My horses, Briar and the gelding, Mason clarified. I purchased them from their previous owner before leaving for Helena. Thought you might need transportation if you return to the homestead. Faith stared at him, touched beyond words by this practical, yet deeply thoughtful gesture. Mason, it's nothing, he said quickly. Practical investment, that's all. But they both knew it was more. Before Faith could find the right words to express her gratitude, Mrs. Holloway returned with a tea tray, effectively ending any possibility of private conversation. The remainder of their allotted 30 minutes passed in stilted small talk. Faith told Mason about her new position at the Mercantile. He spoke of the livery stable and his first impressions of Helena. Throughout, Mrs. Holloway bustled in and out of the room, ostensibly attending to household tasks, but clearly keeping a watchful eye on her newest boarder and her unusual visitor. As their time drew to a close, Mason stood, his hat in his hands. I should be going. Thank you for seeing me, Miss Jensen. The formality between them, necessary for propriety but so at odds with the intimacy they had shared on the trail, felt like a physical barrier. Faith longed to speak openly, to ask the questions that burned in her heart. Instead, she rose and extended her hand. Thank you for calling, Mr. Keller. And for everything else. His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused and achingly familiar. Perhaps, if your schedule permits, you might allow me to show you more of Helena on Sunday, after church services? Faith's heart leaped at the suggestion. I would like that very much. Until Sunday, then. With a respectful nod to Mrs. Holloway, who had materialized in the doorway, as if summoned by the impending conclusion of their visit, Mason departed. Faith watched from the parlor window as he strode down the street, his confident gait and broad shoulders distinctive even among the busy foot traffic. Only when he had disappeared from view did she realize she was clutching the curtain like a lovesick girl. "Mr. Keller seems a decent sort," Mrs. Holloway remarked, gathering the tea things. "For a cowboy." Faith turned, hearing the question beneath the observation. "He saved my life," she said simply. "I would have died alone in that cabin if not for him." The older woman's expression softened slightly. "Providence works in mysterious ways, Miss Jensen. But a young woman in your position must be careful about appearances. Helena is more civilized than some frontier towns, but reputations are still fragile things." "I understand," Faith assured her, though privately she wondered if anyone who hadn't experienced what she and Mason had shared could truly understand the bond it had created. The days until Sunday stretched endlessly. Faith filled them with preparations for her new position, purchasing modest but appropriate work clothes with the small advance Mr. Donovan provided, and becoming acquainted with Helena's geography and citizens. Everywhere she went, people knew of her, or rather, knew a version of her story. The young woman from back east, found half-starved in a remote cabin, rescued and brought to Helena by Mason Keller. The tale had grown in the telling, with some versions casting her as a helpless damsel and Mason as a heroic figure who had battled blizzards, wolves, and even hostile Indians to bring her to safety. Faith found these embellishments both amusing and frustrating. The truth of her stubborn determination to honor her father's dream, of Mason's matter-of-fact competence and unexpected depth, seemed far more compelling than these frontier fairy tales. Sunday dawned bright and clear. Faith dressed carefully in her best dress, a dark green wool that brought out the highlights in her chestnut hair. Mrs. Holloway led her boarders to the Methodist Church, a surprisingly substantial building with real glass windows and a proper bell tower. Faith's attention during the service was divided between the preacher's words and scanning the congregation for Mason's familiar figure. She finally spotted him near the back, somewhat uncomfortable in his Sunday best, but present nonetheless. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded space, and his slight nod sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the church's pot-bellied stove. After the service, as the congregation spilled out into the crisp winter sunshine, Mason made his way to her side. "Miss Jensen," he greeted her formally, tipping his hat to Mrs. Holloway and the other boarders. "I hope you'll still allow me the pleasure of showing you more of our town." Mrs. Holloway's lips thinned slightly, but she nodded. "Miss Jensen must return by 5 o'clock for supper," she stipulated. "And I expect you to remain on main streets, in full view of respectable citizens." "Yes, madam," Mason agreed solemnly, though Faith caught the hint of amusement in his eyes. "I'll have her back promptly." As they walked away from the church, Mason offered his arm in a gesture both protective and proper. Faith placed her hand on his sleeve, acutely conscious of the solid strength beneath the wool coat. "You look well," he said quietly, once they were beyond Mrs. Holloway's hearing. "Helena agrees with you." "It's growing on me," Faith admitted, "though I miss the quiet sometimes. And the stars." Mason nodded understanding. "Town has its advantages, but there's a clarity to life in the open country that's hard to find here." They walked in comfortable silence for a time, Mason occasionally pointing out buildings of interest or introducing Faith to passers-by he knew. Despite only being in Helena a week himself, he seemed to have already established connections throughout the community. "Everyone knows you," Faith observed after he exchanged greetings with a group of businessmen outside the bank. Mason shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "Word travels in places like this. Being Colonel Randall's scout during the last campaign gave me some standing. And," he hesitated, "and," Faith prompted, "and bringing you to town added a romantic element that people enjoy," he admitted. "Some of the stories circulating are quite colorful." Faith laughed. "I've heard a few myself. Apparently, You fought off a mountain lion with your bare hands while I lay dying of fever." His mouth quirked in that almost smile she had come to treasure. "If I'd known I was being so heroic, I might have charged more for the room at Mrs. Holloway's." Their easy banter continued as Mason showed her parts of Helena she hadn't yet explored: the newly constructed theater, the offices of the weekly newspaper, the site where a proper hotel was being built to replace the more rudimentary lodgings that had served the early mining camp. "The town's changing fast," Mason observed as they paused to watch workers framing a new storefront. "When I first passed through 4 years ago, this was all tents and rough cabins. Now look at it. Do you think you'll stay?" Faith asked, the question that had been hovering in her mind all week finally finding voice. "Make it your home." Mason was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains visible beyond the town's edge. "I'm considering it," he said finally. "The livery work suits me. Town's growing in a way that makes a man think about putting down roots." Faith's heart quickened at his words, at the possibilities they suggested. "And the homestead?" she asked. "Do you still think I should return in spring?" He looked down at her then, his blue eyes serious. "That depends on what you want, Faith. Not what you think you owe your father, but what you truly want for yourself." It was the first time he had used her given name since their arrival in Helena, and the intimacy of it, combined with the directness of his question, made her breath catch. Before she could formulate a response, they were interrupted by a call from across the street. "Keller, there you are." A burly man with an impressive mustache waved and crossed toward them, moving with the rolling gait of someone more accustomed to riding than walking. "Logan," Mason greeted him. "Faith, this is James Logan, owner of the livery where I'm working." "Logan, Miss Faith Jensen." The man swept off his hat, revealing a balding head that contrasted comically with his luxuriant facial hair. "Miss Jensen, an honor to meet you at last. Heard all about your ordeal. Terrible business, but fortunate our Keller here was passing by." Faith murmured appropriate pleasantries, noting with interest Logan's possessive "our Keller" and what it suggested about Mason's quick integration into Helena's business community. "Actually, I was hoping to catch you both," Logan continued. "My wife's insisting you come to dinner this evening. Says it's not right, you being new to town and eating boarding house fare your first Sunday here." Mason glanced at Faith, his expression questioning. "That's very kind, but Miss Jensen is expected back by 5. "Nonsense," Logan declared. "I'll speak to the dragon lady myself. Martha's planned a proper feast, and she won't take no for an answer. Besides," he added with a wink at Faith, "she's dying to hear the real story of your journey. Says the versions going around town would shame a dime novelist." Put that way, refusal seemed both impossible and ungracious. Faith found herself agreeing, a mixture of trepidation and excitement fluttering in her chest at the prospect of a proper social engagement with Mason at her side. Logan proved as good as his word, personally escorting them to the boarding house where he engaged in a brief but evidently successful negotiation with Mrs. Holloway. Within the hour, Faith found herself in the Logan's comfortable home, a substantial 2-story structure that reflected the livery owner's prosperity. Martha Logan, a plump, energetic woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, welcomed Faith with genuine warmth. "About time we had some fresh faces in Helena society," she declared, taking Faith's coat. "Too many rough men and not enough civilizing influences, that's what I always say." The evening that followed was the most enjoyable Faith had experienced since her arrival in Helena. The meal was excellent, the conversation lively, and the atmosphere one of genuine hospitality rather than mere curiosity about the rescued Eastern girl. What struck Faith most forcefully, however, was seeing Mason in this new context. Among the Logans and their teenage son and daughter, he revealed facets of himself she hadn't glimpsed before: a dry wit, a gentle way with young Sarah Logan, and a depth of knowledge about subjects ranging from horse bloodlines to territorial politics. "Mason tells us you've taken a position with Donovan," Martha said as they enjoyed apple pie in the parlor after dinner. "A wise choice. Solid business, and Patrick Donovan's a fair employer." Faith nodded. "I start tomorrow. It's nothing like what I imagined when we left Boston, but I'm grateful for the opportunity." "And the homestead?" James Logan asked, puffing on his pipe. "Keller mentioned you might return in spring." Faith glanced at Mason, who was carefully studying his coffee cup. I'm undecided, she admitted. Part of me feels I should try again, for my father's sake. But another part wonders if it's foolish to repeat the same mistake. Martha nodded understanding. The land will wait, dear. Better to find your footing here first. See what Helena has to offer before making such decisions. The conversation turned to other topics, but Faith remained aware of Mason's thoughtful gaze upon her throughout the evening. When it came time to leave, the Logans insisted on sending their carriage to return Faith to the boarding house, despite the short distance. You'll come again next Sunday, Martha declared, rather than asked. Both of you. I won't take no for an answer. Outside, as they waited for the carriage to be brought around, Faith and Mason stood alone on the Logans' porch, their breath forming clouds in the cold night air. They're good people, Faith said. You're fortunate to have found them so quickly. Mason nodded. Logan knew my reputation from when I worked with Colonel Randall. Offered me the position when he heard I was considering settling in Helena. He hesitated, then added, They've been trying to convince me to buy into the business. Logan wants to expand, maybe at a freight company. Says he needs a partner he can trust. Faith turned to him, startled by this revelation. That's a remarkable opportunity. Will you accept? In the soft glow of the porch lantern, Mason's expression was difficult to read. Still considering it. It would mean truly putting down roots here. Committing to Helena as home. The carriage arrived before Faith could respond, but as Mason handed her up into it, their eyes met in a look that held more questions than answers and possibilities neither had yet found words to express. The following weeks settled into a pattern that, while not what Faith had envisioned for herself, brought unexpected contentment. Her position at Donovan's Mercantile proved well suited to her abilities, and the merchant's appreciation for her organizational skills and refined manners led to increased responsibilities and a small raise after just a month. Mason, too, seemed to be thriving. Under his management, the livery stable's business expanded, and rumors circulated that he had indeed accepted Logan's partnership offer, though he had not confirmed this to Faith directly. They saw each other regularly, but always within the strict boundaries of Helena's social proprieties. Sunday dinners at the Logans became a cherished ritual, as did their post-church walks through town. Occasionally, with Mrs. Holloway's grudging permission, Mason would escort Faith to community events, a musical performance at the new theater, a lecture by a visiting dignitary, the town's Founders' Day celebration. Throughout these encounters, something remained unspoken between them. The connection forged in the isolated cabin and strengthened during their journey had neither faded nor been fully acknowledged. Instead, it hovered in the spaces between their careful conversations, in the brush of hands as Mason helped Faith into a carriage, in the way their eyes sought each other across crowded rooms. As winter gave way to the first tentative signs of spring, Faith found herself facing the decision she had been postponing, whether to return to the homestead as originally planned or to embrace the new life taking shape in Helena. The question consumed her thoughts as she worked through the Mercantile's quarterly accounts one quiet afternoon in late March. The steady rhythm of recording figures in the ledger had always helped her think, but today even this familiar task couldn't focus her scattered thoughts. Miss Jensen. Faith looked up to find Mr. Donovan standing beside her desk, his usual jovial expression replaced by one of unusual seriousness. Yes, Mr. Donovan. There's someone here asking after you. Says he knew your father back in Boston. The merchant hesitated. A Mr. Howard Prescott. The name hit Faith like a physical blow. Howard Prescott, her father's former employer, the shipping company owner whose daughter Faith had once been expected to serve as companion. The man whose marriage proposal she had refused before her father announced their plans to head west. Mr. Prescott is here? In Helena? Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Donovan nodded. In the store now. Shall I send him back? Faith smoothed her hair with trembling hands, mind racing. What could possibly have brought Howard Prescott to Montana? Yes, please. Thank you. Moments later, a familiar figure appeared between the shelves of dry goods, tall, distinguished, his tailored Eastern suit incongruous among the practical frontier attire of the store's other customers. At 50, Howard Prescott remained handsome in a patrician way, his dark hair now streaked with silver at the temples, his bearing that of a man accustomed to authority. Faith, he said, removing his hat as he approached her desk. I can scarcely believe I've found you. She rose, professional courtesy overriding her shock. Mr. Prescott, this is unexpected. Indeed. His gaze traveled over her, noting the simple work dress, the practical hairstyle, the ink stains on her fingers. When I learned of your father's passing, I feared the worst. Then rumors reached Boston of a Jensen girl rescued from certain death in the Montana wilderness. I had to see for myself. Faith gestured to the chair beside her desk. Please sit. This must have been a difficult journey. Prescott settled into the offered seat, placing his hat on his knee. No more difficult than the one you and your father undertook. His expression softened with what appeared to be genuine concern. I was deeply sorry to hear of his death, Faith. George was a good man, if sometimes overly romantic in his notions. The familiar criticism of her father stung, but Faith kept her expression neutral. What brings you all the way to Helena, Mr. Prescott? He leaned forward, his voice lowering. You do, Faith. When I learned you had survived, that you were alone in this place, I felt responsible. Your father worked for me for 20 years. I owe it to his memory to ensure his daughter's well-being. Faith stiffened at his tone, the same benevolent condescension that had infused his proposal 2 years earlier, as if her acceptance were a foregone conclusion, a simple matter of recognizing where her best interests lay. I appreciate your concern, she said carefully. But as you can see, I'm quite well. I have employment, lodging, connections in the community. Temporary measures, Prescott dismissed with a wave of his manicured hand. A young woman of your background deserves better than clerking in a frontier store. I've come to take you home, Faith. To Boston, where you belong. The directness of his statement left her momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, he continued, warming to his theme. Your mother's sister has agreed to provide you a home until you're settled. My offer of marriage still stands, of course, though I understand if you need time to consider. The important thing is removing you from these unsuitable circumstances as soon as possible. Faith found her voice at last, anger cutting through her shock. Mr. Prescott, while I'm touched by your concern, I have no intention of returning to Boston. My life is here now. Disbelief crossed his features. Here? Faith, be reasonable. What possible future can Montana offer a woman of your refinement? I've seen this town, it's barely civilized. Half the buildings still have sawdust on the floors. Perhaps that's part of its appeal, she replied evenly. Here, I'm judged by my contributions, not my family connections or social graces. I've found independence I never knew in Boston. Prescott's expression hardened. Independence is a cold comfort on winter nights, my dear. I offer security, position, the life your parents wanted for you before George's foolish Western fever took hold. The conversation might have continued in this vein had the store's bell not jingled, announcing a new customer. Faith glanced up automatically and felt her heart leap as Mason entered, removing his hat as he stepped through the doorway. His eyes found her immediately, as they always did, then narrowed slightly at the sight of the well-dressed stranger sitting beside her desk. With characteristic directness, he crossed the store toward them. Faith, he greeted her, the familiar use of her given name marking the subtle shift in their relationship that had occurred over recent weeks. Everything all right? Before she could respond, Prescott rose, assessing Mason with the cool appraisal of a man accustomed to evaluating others' worth at a glance. Whatever he saw, the practical frontier clothing, the weather-tanned skin, the capable hands that spoke of physical labor clearly did not impress him. Howard Prescott. He introduced himself with brittle politeness. An old friend of the Jensen family from Boston. And you are? Mason Keller. The simple statement carried a quiet confidence that made elaborate explanations unnecessary. Mason turned to Faith, concern evident in his gaze. I was passing by. Thought I'd see if you'd like to join me for dinner at the hotel. Martha Logan mentioned you might appreciate a change from boarding house fare. The invitation, their first proper meal alone together since arriving in Helena, would normally have thrilled Faith. Now, caught between these two men who represented such different possibilities for her future, she felt momentarily paralyzed. Prescott broke the silence. Miss Jensen and I are discussing important matters concerning her return to Boston. Perhaps another time would be more appropriate for social engagements. Mason's expression didn't change, But Faith saw the slight tightening around his eyes, the only indication that Prescott's dismissive tone had registered. "Is that so?" Mason asked, his gaze never leaving Faith's face. "Planning to leave Helena, then?" The question hung between them, weighted with meanings beyond the simple words. Faith realized with sudden clarity that her answer would define not just this moment, but everything that might follow. "No," she said firmly, looking directly at Mason. "I have no plans to return to Boston. My life is here now." The relief that flashed across his features was brief, but unmistakable. Prescott made a sound of exasperation. "Faith, you're being absurd. What possible reason could you have for remaining in this wilderness, when Boston offers everything a young woman could desire?" Faith turned to him, finding her resolve strengthening with each word. "Because in Boston I was only ever George Jensen's daughter, a suitable match, a proper young lady. Here, I'm myself, just Faith. And I've discovered I prefer that person to the one I was expected to be." "This is about more than your preference," Prescott insisted, his voice hardening. "It's about practicality, about your future security. What does Helena offer that could possibly compare to what awaits you in Boston?" "Me." The single word from Mason silenced both Faith and Prescott. They turned to find him standing straight and sure, his blue eyes fixed on Faith with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm staying in Helena," he continued, speaking to Faith as if Prescott weren't present. "Signed the partnership papers with Logan yesterday. I'm building a house on the north side of town, near the creek." He paused, then added with simple directness, "It would be big enough for two. Or more, eventually." Faith stared at him, her heart pounding. Could this be what she thought it was? "Mr. Keller," Prescott began, outrage coloring his tone. "I hardly think—" "I'm not speaking to you, sir," Mason interrupted, his gaze never leaving Faith's face. "I'm speaking to the woman whose candlelight I saw through a blizzard. The woman who survived alone for months because she believed in keeping faith with her father's dream. The woman I've come to," he hesitated, then finished simply, "to care for more than I thought possible." The mercantile had gone silent. Other customers, and even Mr. Donovan, clearly listening to this unexpected drama unfolding beside the account desk. Faith barely noticed them. Her world narrowed to Mason's steady gaze and the choice before her. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" she whispered. Mason nodded slowly. "Not how I planned it. Meant to speak to Reverend Collins first, do things proper. But yes, Faith Jensen, I'm asking if you'll consider building a life here. With me." Prescott made a sound of disgust. "This is preposterous. Faith, surely you can't be considering a proposal from a Cowboy you've known for what, a few months? Think of your position, your family name." Faith turned to him, a gentle sadness replacing her earlier anger. "Mr. Prescott, my father brought me west because he believed we could create something new here, something that wasn't defined by Boston's expectations. He was right about that, even if his methods were flawed." She straightened her shoulders. "I appreciate your concern and the effort you've made in coming here. But my answer is the same as it was 2 years ago. No." Prescott's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Without another word, he collected his hat and strode from the store, the bell jingling violently as the door slammed behind him. In the silence that followed, Faith became acutely aware of the audience their exchange had attracted. Mr. Donovan cleared his throat loudly. "Don't you all have shopping to do?" he called to the lingering customers. "Miss Jensen deserves some privacy, I reckon." As the onlookers dispersed, Faith turned back to Mason, who had remained steadfast throughout the confrontation. "Did you mean it?" she asked quietly. "About the house. About us." His weathered face softened. "Every word. Though I'd planned something more romantic than blurting it out in Donovan's mercantile with half the town listening." A laugh bubbled up from Faith's chest, releasing the tension of the past hour. "I think it was perfect. Unexpected, honest, direct, just like you." She reached for his hand, no longer concerned with propriety. "Just like us." Mason's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and sure. "Is that a yes, then?" Faith thought of the lonely cabin where her candle had burned low, of the moment this man had appeared at her door like an answer to desperate prayers. She thought of their journey together, of the trust and understanding that had grown between them, of the life Helena offered, not the life she had planned, but perhaps the one she was meant to find. Yes, she said, her voice steady with certainty. It's a yes. The summer of 1877 saw Helena's first society wedding of note, not the grandest by Eastern standards, perhaps, but one that captured the frontier town's imagination. Faith Jensen, the Boston girl rescued from certain death in the wilderness, married Mason Keller, former Army scout and now prominent business owner, in a ceremony that blended Eastern refinement with Western practicality. The Methodist Church overflowed with guests, from the highest echelons of Helena society to ranch hands and miners who knew Mason from his traveling days. Martha Logan had taken personal charge of the arrangements, determined that her young friends would have a celebration worthy of their remarkable story. The Donovan Mercantile closed for the day, its owner serving as Mason's best man. Even Mrs. Holloway unbent enough to contribute her prized lace tablecloth for the reception held in the newly completed hotel's dining room. Faith wore a gown of ivory silk ordered from San Francisco, with wildflowers in her hair, instead of the traditional orange blossoms. Mason, uncomfortable but dignified in a new suit, waited for her at the altar with an expression that transformed from nervous tension to awestruck wonder as she walked toward him on Mr. Donovan's arm. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music and dancing and more food than even the substantial gathering could consume. As darkness fell, the newlyweds slipped away to the house. Mason had built a sturdy two-story structure of squared logs and proper windows, with a wide porch facing the mountains and a fenced paddock where Briar and Mason's gelding now grazed. Inside, Faith discovered Mason's final wedding gift, a proper Boston rocking chair placed before the stone fireplace, and beside it, a small table holding her mother's Bible and a silver candlestick that caught the firelight with warm gleams. For when you want to read at night, Mason explained, suddenly shy in this most intimate of moments. I know how you love your books. Faith touched the candlestick, emotion tightening her throat. It's beautiful. Thought you should have a proper one, he said. Better than that tin thing from the cabin. The reference to their beginning to the guttering candle that had guided him to her door brought tears to Faith's eyes. I was praying that night, she whispered. Praying so hard for help, for some sign I wasn't alone. Mason stepped closer, his hands gentle as they framed her face. And I was just a cowboy looking for shelter from a storm. His smile held wonder and gratitude in equal measure. Never thought I'd find home instead. Your answer's here, Faith murmured, echoing his words from that first night as she rose on tiptoe to meet his kiss. In the years that followed, Helena continued to grow and prosper, transforming from frontier outpost to established city. The Keller and Logan livery expanded into a successful freight company, then a stagecoach line connecting Helena to the more remote settlements. Mason's practical knowledge of the territory combined with Faith's head for business created an enterprise that provided handsomely for their growing family. The homestead remained in Faith's name, though they visited only occasionally a summer cabin more than a working farm. It stood as a memorial to her father's dream and a reminder of the journey that had brought them together. On the 5th anniversary of their meeting, Mason surprised Faith with a special gift, a journal bound in soft leather, its first page inscribed in his careful hand, "For Faith, whose candle guided me home." That night, as their children slept upstairs and snow fell gently outside, Faith sat in her Boston rocker beside the fire, the journal open on her lap. Mason watched from his chair opposite as she began to write their story, not the embellished version that had become local legend, but the true account of a woman's courage, a man's kindness, and the answer to a prayer that had come knocking on a desperate winter night.